Welcome to Sci-Fi Traveler, friends. In this episode, we'll be listening to the incredible story of Daniel and Adeline. Grab a cup of coffee and sit back. Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. The canyon had a name on the old survey maps, Keller's Reach, after the geologist who had first descended into it 3 centuries ago and reportedly never stopped complaining about the heat. Daniel had never met anyone else who knew that. He had never met anyone, period, who came to Voss 4 voluntarily, which was either a mark of the planet's spectacular unattractiveness or a mark of something particular about Daniel himself. He had long since stopped trying to determine which. His station sat at the canyon's upper lip like a tooth that hadn't quite fallen out, a cluster of prefab modules bolted together over years of grudging expansion, bristling with antenna arrays and sensor dishes, and one atmospheric processor that worked roughly 60% of the time, and which he had named Gerald after his least favorite instructor from technical school. Gerald the processor had a personality, in the way that machines maintained by one person in total isolation for 4 years inevitably develop personalities. It expressed itself primarily through timing. The processor always chose to malfunction during meals, or during the 17-minute window each evening when the twin suns of the Voss system dropped below the canyon wall simultaneously and turned the sky a particular shade of amber that made Daniel feel, briefly and against his better judgment, that the universe was not entirely indifferent to his existence. He had been eating a ration pack of something that claimed to be lentil soup when the crash happened. The sound came first, a tearing, concussive shriek that rolled across the canyon floor and hit the station walls hard enough to rattle every loose panel Daniel had been meaning to tighten for the past 8 months. He was on his feet before the echo died, soup abandoned, already pulling on his descent harness with the particular efficiency of a man who has rehearsed emergencies so many times in his head that his hands move independently of his thoughts. By the time he reached the canyon edge and looked down, the dust cloud was still rising, a dark orange tower of displaced rock and grit that caught the last of the afternoon light and held it like something burning. The ship was not small. That was the first thing he registered. Whatever had come down into Keller's Reach, it had not come quietly, and it had not come in pieces. The vessel was largely intact, which, given the angle of impact and the speed suggested by the gouge it had carved through the canyon wall on the way down, was something approaching physically improbable. Daniel stood at the rim for a moment with the wind pulling at his jacket and did the mental calculation that any sensible person would do. The ship was 300 meters below him. The descent would take 40 minutes on a good day, and there was a non-trivial chance the whole thing was about to explode. He started climbing down. It took him 47 minutes because the second anchor point on his line had been slightly loose, and he'd had to stop and fix it halfway, which he chose to interpret as the universe rewarding thoroughness rather than punishing procrastination. By the time he reached the canyon floor, the dust had begun to settle, drifting in slow curtains through the air and coating everything in that particular rust red that Voss 4 applied to all surfaces like a signature. The ship sat half-embedded in the far wall of the canyon, its nose buried in rock, its tail section twisted at an angle that made Daniel's engineering instincts wince sympathetically. The identification markings on the hull were either obscured by impact damage or had never been there to begin with. He noted this with the professional neutrality of a man who had learned, some time ago, that the questions least likely to cause him problems were the ones he didn't ask. She was standing beside the ship. He almost didn't see her at first. She was still, in the way that very few people are naturally still, not the stillness of shock or injury but something more deliberate, as if she had decided the situation had been assessed and found manageable, and there was no further use in reacting to it. She was watching him descend the last 20 meters of canyon wall. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply waited, and when he reached the ground and turned to face her properly, she regarded him with a pair of dark eyes that held the particular expression of someone doing arithmetic. She was tall, golden-skinned in a way the Voss light seemed to collaborate with, as if the two had made a prior arrangement. Her ears swept upward through her dark hair in long, elegant points, and Daniel, who had spent enough time in the outer systems to have seen most of the galaxy's variations on a humanoid theme, registered this and moved on without ceremony. What he could not quite move past was her expression, or rather, the profound economy of it. Whatever she was thinking, she had decided he did not need to see it. "Are you injured?" he asked. She considered this. "No." "Is anyone else on the ship?" "No." He looked at the vessel. The vessel looked back at him in the way that only badly damaged spacecraft can, with a kind of honest structural despair. He exhaled slowly through his nose and turned back to her. "Right," he said. "I'm Daniel. I run the monitoring station up there." He gestured upward at the canyon rim, which was currently invisible behind the dust haze. "I have tools. And I have soup technically, although at this point it's more of a concept than a meal." He paused. "Do you want help?" She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. "Yes," she said. Daniel nodded once, in the manner of a man who had already begun mentally cataloging what he would need, and in what order. Behind him, somewhere far above, Gerald the atmospheric processor chose this precise moment to emit the long, mournful alert tone that meant it had decided to stop working again. He did not find this surprising. The first thing Daniel learned about Adeline was that she knew which end of a torque driver to hold. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. In 4 years of operating a remote monitoring station at the edge of a system that most galactic navigation charts labeled simply as peripheral, Daniel had received exactly 3 visitors, and all 3 of them had at some point picked up one of his tools and held it with the specific helpless uncertainty of someone who had been handed an artifact from an unfamiliar civilization. He had learned to find this endearing rather than frustrating, mostly because the alternative was despair. But Adeline picked up the torque driver he had set beside the access panel without looking at him for guidance, found the correct grip, and applied exactly the right pressure to the fastener on the first attempt. He noticed this. He did not say anything about it. He filed it. They had spent the first morning hauling equipment down from the station, a process that involved Daniel's aging cargo pulley, 40 meters of fraying tension line, and a philosophical acceptance of the fact that the third crate was simply going to swing into the canyon wall no matter what he did. Adeline had watched the crate make contact with the rock face, with an expression of such perfect composure that Daniel had felt, obscurely, that he was the one being evaluated. He made a joke about the crate's navigational instincts. She did not laugh. The corner of her left eye moved slightly, which he was beginning to understand might be the relevant unit of measurement. By midday they were beneath the ship's belly, which was where the worst of it was. The impact had sheared 3 of the primary landing struts entirely, and folded a 4th back into the ventral hull, plating at an angle that a structural engineer would have described in clinical terms, and Daniel described, privately, as malicious. The drive assembly had survived better than he'd expected. There was damage to the intake manifold, and at least 2 coolant lines had ruptured, which explained the faint chemical sweetness in the air that his suit sensors kept flagging with the anxious persistence of a system that had been programmed by someone who believed in thorough alarming. The hull breaches were manageable. The power coupling to the navigation array was less manageable. He lay on his back in the red dust and stared up at it for a long moment. "This is going to take 3 days," he said to the underside of the ship. "Yes," Adeline said, from somewhere to his left, where she had been examining the coolant line ruptures with the same focused attention she gave to everything, which was to say, complete and somehow without urgency, as if time were a resource she had already budgeted in amounts he was not aware of. "I'm saying that," Daniel continued, still addressing the hull, "because I want to be transparent about the timeline, and also because the last time I told myself something would take 3 days it took 11, and I'm trying to manage my own expectations by making them someone else's problem." There was a pause. That is an unusual strategy, Adeline said. It's not working very well, he agreed, but I've been doing it for so long I can't stop now. He pulled himself out from under the ship and sat up. The Voss suns were directly overhead, which meant the canyon floor was receiving approximately as much shade as the surface of a star, and his water canteen was nearly empty already. He reached for it, drank what was left, and then noticed Adeline watching him with an expression that had shifted by some small fraction toward something he couldn't name. She reached into the pack she had brought down from the ship, the only thing she had brought from the ship, a single weather-worn bag that told him nothing, and produced a canteen of her own. She held it out to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. "You don't have to. You need water," she said, with the air of someone stating a navigational fact rather than making an offer. "Drink." Daniel drank. The water was cold in a way that was not entirely explainable by the ambient temperature, and had a faint mineral quality that he could not place to any system he knew. He handed it back without asking. She accepted it without explanation. They sat for a moment in the shade of the damaged hull, with the canyon walls rising around them in their slow, rust-colored silence, and Daniel became aware that this was the most comfortable he had felt in the company of another person in longer than he wanted to calculate. He found this information mildly alarming. He returned to work. The afternoon passed in a rhythm that surprised him by feeling like a rhythm at all. The particular back and forth of two people working on the same problem from different angles, which only functions smoothly when both people understand the problem, and which Daniel had not experienced since his last posting, 3 stations and 5 years ago, before the series of decisions and non-decisions that had deposited him at the edge of the Voss system, with a processor named Gerald, and a lot of time to think. Adeline did not ask what each component did. She did not ask him to explain his process. She watched once, understood, and then did. Occasionally she identified a fault before he reached it, and said so in her quiet, economical way. The secondary seal on that coupling is also compromised, and was correct each time. By the 3rd hour he had stopped being surprised by this. By the 5th hour he had begun to find it comfortable, which was different and more interesting, and something he chose not to examine directly in the way that one chooses not to look directly at the Voss suns. When the twin sunsets came, they came the way they always did on Voss 4, not gradually but in 2 distinct stages, as each star dropped behind the canyon's western wall in sequence, separated by about 12 minutes of strange intermediate light that turned everything a deep and saturated gold. Daniel had watched this happen nearly every day for 4 years, and had never entirely gotten used to it. He looked up from the panel he was resealing, and saw Adeline standing at the edge of the ship's shadow, watching the light change on the canyon wall opposite. Her golden skin caught it in a way that made the air around her seem to participate. She was not doing anything. She was simply watching. Daniel watched her watch it. Then he looked back at his panel, because he was a man with a functional sense of his own dignity, and also because the power coupling was not going to reseal itself, and Gerald had just begun transmitting the low-frequency hum that meant the atmospheric processor was technically working again, but had opinions about it. "He does that," Daniel said to the general air. Adeline glanced back at him. "The station. The processor, I call him Gerald." He paused. "He has feelings about being ignored." She looked at the station, far above them, and then back at the panel in his hands. "Does it help?" she asked, naming it. Daniel considered this seriously. "I think it helps Gerald," he said. "I'm less certain it helps me." The corner of her mouth moved. He counted it. The second night, Daniel made the mistake of thinking out loud. It was not, in his defense, an unusual habit. 4 years of near-total solitude had done something to his relationship with silence. Not broken it, exactly, but renegotiated it, so that silence was now something he moved through rather than something he inhabited. He talked to Gerald. He talked to his tools. He had, on one occasion that he did not think about often, conducted a 20-minute debate with a malfunctioning pressure valve about whether it was being deliberately difficult or simply expressing a manufacturing defect, and had come away from the experience genuinely uncertain who had won. Talking was how he processed. It was a system. It had flaws, but so did Gerald, and he hadn't replaced Gerald either. They were on the second night's work. The navigation array coupling, which had turned out to be even less manageable than he had originally assessed, a fact he was choosing to experience as a personal growth opportunity. And Adeline was 3 meters away along the hull, running a diagnostic on the sensor grid with a handheld reader she had produced from that same weathered bag, which apparently contained significantly more than its exterior dimensions suggested. Daniel had stopped asking questions about the bag. The bag was its own category of thing, and he respected it. He was lying on his back again. He did his best thinking lying on his back. Something about the angle redistributed the relevant blood. "The ship's too good," he said, to the hull above him. Adeline did not respond. This was not unusual. He had learned that her silences were not dismissals. They were more like the silences of someone reading, a held attention that had simply not yet finished processing the incoming information. He had started to find them comfortable, which was new, because he had previously found all silences either comfortable or uncomfortable based on whether he was alone, and the category of comfortable silence with another person present had not existed for him in recent memory. "I mean structurally," he continued. "The damage profile is wrong for an uncontrolled descent. The way the struts sheared, that's not random failure. The energy was distributed. Someone designed this ship to survive a bad landing, which means someone anticipated bad landings, which means—" He stopped, started again. "Scout vessels don't usually get that kind of engineering budget. The intake manifold alone is a grade of alloy I've only seen in military applications, and I've seen a lot of manifolds." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking," he added. "I want to be clear that I'm not asking. I'm simply narrating, for Gerald's benefit." Gerald finds the technical details soothing. "Gerald," Adeline said from her section of hull, "is not here." "Gerald is spiritually omnipresent," Daniel said. "I've made my peace with it." There was a pause. Then in the same quiet register she used for everything, Adeline said, "You are observant." Daniel considered the ceiling of the ship above his face for a moment. "I've had a lot of time and very little to look at," he said. "It sharpens certain things." He reached for the coupling and resumed working. "The navigation array, for example, is calibrated for ranges I didn't think civilian equipment could access. And the scrambled identification codes, I've seen that done, but not like that. Usually when someone removes ship markings, they leave traces. Material traces, scoring patterns, residue. Yours are just absent, as if the ship was built without them." He paused, which is a different kind of decision than removing them afterward. The canyon was very quiet. The vast night had settled fully over the rim above them, and the stars were extraordinary in the way that stars only are when there is no competing light for 100 kilometers in any direction. Dense and uncountable and faintly blue shifted toward the core, spread across the gap of sky above the canyon walls like something spilled and never cleaned up. Daniel had a complicated relationship with those stars. They were beautiful in a way he had never quite found the correct response to. "You said you weren't asking," Adeline said. "I'm genuinely not," Daniel said. "I'm building a theory. It's a hobby. I build theories about people I meet because I meet so few of them that each one represents a significant data set." He pulled himself halfway out from under the coupling access and looked across the hull toward her. She was watching him with that same still, arithmetic expression. "My current theory," he said, "is that you're a wanderer, someone who knows the outer systems well, too well for a casual traveler, but the outer systems specifically, not the core. The way you read the canyon terrain when we descended this morning. The way you handled the atmospheric sensor calibration without asking what the local particulate index was. You already knew roughly what it would be. You've spent time in desert margin systems. He paused. Also, you carry a bag that violates at least 2 laws of physical volume, which speaks to experience. Adeline looked at him steadily. And the rest of your theory? Someone the galaxy has mostly forgotten about, he said, and returned to the coupling. Or someone who has forgotten about the galaxy. I haven't decided which. Possibly both. The two conditions tend to converge in my experience. He worked in silence for a moment. I find I don't need to know which. I want to be honest about that. I've stopped needing the full picture of people. It used to bother me. Now I think the partial picture is usually the more accurate one anyway, because the full picture is mostly what people decide to show you, and that's not the same thing. He had not entirely meant to say that last part. It was the second night effect, something about sustained sleeplessness and canyon starlight that loosened the connection between his thoughts and his better judgment. He moved on quickly. The soup situation has also improved, he said, with the air of someone changing subjects with tremendous dignity. I found a second ration pack at the bottom of the equipment crate. It claims to be minestrone. I have chosen to believe it. Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then, why? Because the alternative is despair, Daniel said, and despair doesn't fix navigation arrays. He heard something then, not a word and not quite a laugh, but something in the space between, a brief exhaled sound that carried in quality he had not heard from her before. Light, almost. Like a door opened just slightly in a room that had been closed. He kept his eyes on the coupling. He was a man with a functional sense of his own dignity. But he noted it, in the careful internal ledger he had been keeping since the moment she'd handed him the torque driver without being asked. A ledger that was accumulating entries faster than he had expected, and which he was beginning to suspect was about something other than engineering. Above them, unreachable and indifferent, the stars of the outer rim burned on in their uncountable thousands. And Gerald, spiritually omnipresent, said nothing, which was either wisdom or malfunction, and with Gerald it was genuinely difficult to tell. The third morning arrived the way third mornings always do, with the specific, unearned confidence of something that does not know it is about to matter. Daniel had slept 4 hours on the canyon floor, with his jacket folded under his head, and his back making its customary list of grievances, and had woken to find Adeline already awake, sitting with her back against the ship's hull, and her eyes on the strip of pre-dawn sky visible between the canyon walls, which was currently the particular deep violet that existed for approximately 11 minutes each morning, before the first sun breached the rim and turned everything gold. She had the canteen in her hands. She was not drinking from it. She was simply holding it, in the way that people hold things when they are thinking about something that has nothing to do with the thing in their hands. Daniel sat up. His back submitted its grievances formally. He acknowledged them and tabled them for later, which was his standard procedure. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept," she said, without looking away from the sky. "When?" "Earlier." He decided to accept this. He was too tired to cross-examine and too experienced with his own sleep deprivation to throw stones. He reached into the equipment pack, found the ration bar he had saved from the night before, broke it in half without thinking about it, and held out the larger portion toward her. She looked at it, then at him. Then she took it, in the same matter-of-fact way she had accepted the tools and the water and every other small thing he had offered over the past 2 days, not with gratitude exactly, but with a quality of acknowledgement that felt more serious than gratitude, as if she were registering not just the object but the gesture behind it and filing it somewhere carefully. It occurred to him, eating his half of the ration bar in the violet pre-dawn silence of a canyon, on a planet that most of the galaxy had correctly identified as not worth the fuel to visit, that he was more comfortable than he had been in years. This was inconvenient information. He set it aside next to his back's grievances and focused on the day's work. The navigation array coupling had finally yielded the previous night. He had felt the moment it seated correctly with the particular satisfaction of a problem that has been argued with long enough. And what remained today was the hull breech sealing, the coolant line replacement, and the landing strut reconstruction, which was the most materials-intensive part, and the one he had been quietly most anxious about. Because his station's fabrication unit was competent but not exceptional, and the strut specifications he had pulled from the ship's own damaged maintenance files had made him pause for longer than he had shown. The specifications were imperial standard. He had looked at them for a moment in the blue light of his diagnostic screen, in the middle of the second night, and then he had closed the file and continued working, and not said anything about it. Because he was a man who had made a deliberate practice of not asking questions, and also because the struts needed to be built regardless of what they implied, and also because he had looked at Adeline across the hull and found her watching him with that still, unreadable expression, and had understood, in the wordless way that two people sometimes understand things, that she had known what was in the file and had been watching to see what he would do with it. He had done nothing with it. He had built the struts. They were good struts. He felt the fabrication unit had exceeded its own expectations, and he had told it so in the same spirit in which he told Gerald things, because encouragement costs nothing and the universe has few enough reasons to try harder. By mid-morning they were sealing the last of the hull breaches, working from opposite ends toward the center in a pattern they had arrived at without discussion. They came over the canyon rim like a closing hand. Daniel had seen large ships before. He had done a posting near the Verath Station shipyards early in his career, where vessels the size of small moons were assembled in dry dock over periods of years, and he had stood at the observation deck on his lunch breaks and felt the specific smallness that only truly large things can produce in a person. He thought he had made his peace with scale. He understood intellectually that the universe was very big and he was very small, and he had arranged his life in accordance with this understanding, which was part of why he was here, at the edge of everything, where the scale was at least honest about itself. But the ships that came over the rim of Keller's Reach were something different. They were black, which was the first thing, not the black of space, which has depth and distance in it, but a flat, absolute black that seemed to consume the light around it rather than reflect it, as if each vessel had been engineered not just to exist, but to assert its existence as the primary fact of any environment it entered. They moved in formation with a silence that his sensors told him was impossible at their mass and speed, and yet the silence was there, total and deliberate, as though sound itself had been informed of the situation and had made a policy decision. There were 9 of them, he counted. He was not sure why he counted, except that it gave his hand something to do other than shake. They arranged themselves across the sky above the canyon in a formation that left no ambiguity about purpose. This was not a search pattern. This was not a survey approach. This was the specific spatial grammar of a fleet that has found what it was looking for, and is now making a statement about that fact in the only language available to 9 black warships over a remote desert canyon. The outpost's 11 permanent residents had all come outside. Daniel knew this not because he could see them from the canyon floor, but because his station's external sensors relayed their positions to his wrist display with the automatic fidelity of a system that monitored everything and distinguished between nothing. 11 biosigns, distributed across the outpost's upper platform and the 2 exterior access points. All stationary, all grouped in the posture that his sensor array recorded as low center of gravity, reduced movement profile, which was the clinical way of saying that 11 people had looked up at the sky and then gotten as close to the ground as they could manage without lying down. They were kneeling, all 11 of them. Daniel stood on the canyon floor with a coolant line coupler still in his left hand and looked at his wrist display, and understood this with a clarity that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the part of the human nervous system that predates logic by several million years. The part that knows before the thinking mind catches up when something fundamental has changed. He turned. She was already watching him. Adeline stood where she had stood all morning beside the ship, at the edge of its shadow in the gold light of the vast afternoon. She was wearing his spare jacket. There was engine grease on her left hand from the coolant work they had done together an hour ago, and her hair had collected the fine rust-colored dust that Voss 4 applied to everything without preference or discrimination. And she was watching him with that expression, still and patient and arithmetical, except that something in it had shifted in the way that things shift when a held breath is finally released. Not dramatically, not with announcement, simply a change in the quality of the attention, as if she had been waiting for him to turn around and had arranged herself accordingly. The wrench was in his right hand. He was not sure when he had picked it up. His hands had apparently been making independent decisions, which was a habit they had when the rest of him was otherwise occupied. It slipped from his fingers. It hit the dust with a sound that, in the total silence of 9 warships holding position above a canyon on a planet that had never in its history been important, was extraordinarily loud. She looked down at it, then back at him. Daniel was aware of several things simultaneously, in the layered way that the mind processes information when it has received more than its comfortable operating capacity and is doing its best. He was aware of the fleet above him. He was aware of the 11 people kneeling on the outpost platform. He was aware of the Imperial Standard specifications in the ship's maintenance file, and the military-grade alloy in the intake manifold, and the canteen with the cold water that tasted of no system he could name, and the way she had handed him the torque driver on the first morning without being asked, and the way she had eaten half a ration bar in the pre-dawn violet, and watched the sky in a manner that he now understood was not nostalgia, but something more complicated. He was also aware that he was standing in front of her with dust on his face, and a sleep deficit that spanned 3 days, and a coolant line coupler still in his left hand, and that these facts were not going to change regardless of what the sky currently contained. He looked up once at the fleet, at the black ships arranged across the canyon's mouth like a deliberate punctuation mark at the end of a sentence he had been reading without understanding. He looked back at her. "Gerald knew, didn't he?" he said. It was not a question. It came out the way things come out when the brain has bypassed the editorial process entirely and gone directly to transmission. And what it transmitted was not the most important or the most intelligent or the most dignified thing he could have said, but it was, he would later reflect, probably the most honest. Adeline looked at him for a moment with an expression that had done something entirely new. The arithmetic was still there, but beside it, or beneath it, was something that might have been the closest thing to surprise that her face knew how to make. Then the corner of her mouth moved, more than it ever had before, enough that it qualified, by any reasonable standard, as an actual smile, brief and contained, and carrying a quality he could not entirely name, except that it was warm, and that it reached something in her eyes that he had not seen there before, and that it lasted approximately 2 seconds before she recovered herself, and returned to her customary composure with the efficiency of someone who has had a great deal of practice at exactly that. "Gerald," she said, "is an atmospheric processor." "Gerald," Daniel said, "has always had opinions above his station. No pun intended." He paused. Some pun intended. Above them, the fleet held its position in absolute silence. Somewhere on the outpost platform, 11 people remained on their knees, waiting. The canyon held its rust-colored stillness around them both. The vast afternoon light caught her golden skin and did what it always did, collaborated with it, conspired with it, made the air around her seem to participate in something he didn't have the vocabulary for. He picked up the wrench. He did not know why. His hands were still operating on their own initiative, and apparently they felt the wrench should be recovered. He straightened up and looked at her and said the only other thing that was true. "You could have told me." She held his gaze. The smile was gone now, but whatever had been behind it was still there, quieter and less legible. "Yes," she said, "but you didn't." "No." He waited. She let the silence sit for a moment. in the way she always let silences sit, without discomfort, without the anxious need to fill them that afflicted most people, including and especially himself. "You treated me," she said, finally, carefully, as if selecting the words from a larger supply of words she had considered and decided against, "as though I were simply a person who needed help." Daniel looked at her, at the grease on her hand, at his jacket on her shoulders, which was too wide across and too short in the sleeve, and which she had worn for 2 days without complaint, at the canyon behind her and the ship they had repaired together in the dust and the heat and the twin sunset gold. "You were," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Above them, 9 black warships waited in their absolute silence, carrying their absolute authority, representing the full weight of an empire that Daniel had only ever encountered in passing references and navigation charts, and the kind of political news that felt, from the outer rim, like weather happening in a country he had never visited. And Adeline, who was, his nervous system was still in the process of fully informing him, something considerably more than a wanderer, did not look away from him. The soldier who descended into the canyon was the tallest person Daniel had ever seen, which was saying something, because Daniel was not short and had spent time in systems where the local gravity produced people of considerable vertical ambition. This soldier was tall in a way that seemed like a personal decision, rather than a biological outcome, tall, and armored in the same flat black as the ships above, and moving down the canyon access path with the specific, contained efficiency of someone who has been trained to enter situations without disturbing them, which was a skill Daniel respected professionally and found deeply unsettling in the present context. He stopped at a respectful distance. He put his fist to his chest in a gesture that was clearly formal and clearly practiced and clearly directed at Adeline, and then he waited, with the stillness of someone who has been trained to wait indefinitely and means it. Adeline looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Daniel. "I need to speak with my fleet commander," she said. "It will take a few minutes." Daniel looked at the soldier. The soldier looked at Daniel with the professional blankness of someone whose job requires them to have no visible opinions about civilians who are standing in canyon floors with coolant line couplers and recently retrieved wrenches. "I'll be here," Daniel said. "Gerald and I will hold down the canyon." She held his gaze for one more moment, that same quality of attention she had given everything over the past 3 days, complete and unhurried. And then she walked toward the soldier, and they moved a short distance away and spoke in voices too low to carry, and Daniel turned around and looked at the damaged canyon wall and had what he could only describe as a private moment of processing. It lasted about 45 seconds, which was all he could afford, and then he did what he always did when faced with a situation that exceeded his comfortable operating parameters. He found a task. There was a section of hull near the port strut he hadn't quite finished inspecting, a stress point he had noted and mentally flagged for later. Later had arrived. He crouched beside it and ran his scanner over it slowly, and let the familiar language of alloy density readings and structural integrity scores do what it always did, anchor him. The scan came back clean. Of course it did. He had built good struts. The ship is ready to fly. He stood. Adeline had returned, alone. The soldier had retreated back up the canyon path with the same contained efficiency with which he had arrived, apparently having delivered or received whatever was necessary and considering his role in the situation complete. "I know," Daniel said. "I finished it this morning technically. The coolant line was the last thing." She nodded once. She was looking at the ship with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, not the arithmetic, not the patient stillness, but something more complex and quieter, the look of someone regarding a thing that has multiple meanings and is deciding which one to address first. "The fleet has been searching for 3 days," she said. "A navigation error brought me into the VOS system at the wrong vector. The crash was a consequence of that." Daniel absorbed this. "A navigation error," he said. "Yes." "On an Imperial scout vessel, with a navigation array calibrated for ranges that civilian equipment can't access. She looked at him steadily. Even exceptional equipment, she said, operated by distracted pilots makes errors. He considered this for a moment. What were you distracted by? The corner of her mouth moved. The view, she said, and did not elaborate, and he understood from the way she said it that elaborating was not on offer, and that pressing the point would be both impolite and unsuccessful. So he filed it in the same drawer as the bag's dimensional anomalies and the canteen's inexplicable mineral taste, and moved on. You should know, Adeline said, and her voice had shifted into something that was not quite the tone she used for working conversation, and not quite the tone she had used with the soldier, but something between the two, more deliberate and more careful, that what you've done here carries certain implications. You've repaired an Imperial vessel. You have handled classified drive components and accessed sealed maintenance files. Daniel looked at her. I accessed the maintenance files to build your struts. Yes. The struts I needed to build so your ship could fly. Yes. So what you're saying, he said slowly, is that doing my job competently has given me a security clearance I did not apply for, did not want, and will presumably come with documentation. Considerable documentation, she said, and a security classification at the 4th Imperial tier, which carries certain restrictions on travel and communication that will need to be discussed with the relevant administrative offices. Daniel stared at her. There are administrative offices. There are always administrative offices. He turned this over for a moment. Gerald is going to be insufferable about this, he said. She looked at him with an expression that had now settled into something he had not seen from her before, and could not quite name, warm and direct, and carrying a quality of openness that all her previous expressions had held back, like a room that has finally turned its lights on. Gerald, she said, will be provided with a formal commendation from the Imperial Engineering Corps for services rendered to the Crown vessel. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. Gerald is an atmospheric processor. Gerald maintained life support conditions for the duration of the repair operation, she said. The Imperial Engineering Corps has a broad definition of services rendered. He looked up at the station on the canyon rim, at the cluster of prefab modules and antenna arrays, and the processor unit that had been malfunctioning with personality and opinions for 4 years, and tried to imagine how he was going to explain this to it. He decided he would let the commendation speak for itself. Gerald would understand, in whatever way Gerald understood things, and would probably celebrate by choosing an inconvenient moment to malfunction, which was the closest thing to joy that he had ever observed in the machine. The twin suns had begun their afternoon descent, and the canyon was moving into the intermediate light, that deep gold hour before the first sunset that had marked the end of each working day for the past 3 days, the light that caught Adeline's skin and conspired with it. She was watching him think. She did this, he had learned, when she was waiting for him to arrive at something, and the patience with which she did it had stopped unsettling him sometime on the 2nd day, and had started feeling, instead, like a kind of respect. You're leaving, he said. It was not a question. Yes. He nodded slowly. He looked at the ship, at the struts he had fabricated and the hull he had sealed, and the coupling he had argued with for most of 2 nights and finally persuaded into cooperation. It was a good repair. The best work he had done in years, possibly, which was either a commentary on the quality of the challenge or on what it does to a person's standards when they stop caring whether anyone notices. He had cared these 3 days. He had cared more than he could easily account for. Daniel, Adeline said. He looked at her. The 4th Imperial Tier Security Classification, she said, with the precision of someone who has chosen their words from a very large available supply and is certain of each one, requires periodic review, in person, at a location to be determined by the issuing authority. He held her gaze. How periodic? The review schedule, she said, is at the discretion of the issuing authority. The canyon held its silence around them. Above, The fleet waited in its absolute black patience, and the stars were beginning to show at the far edge of the sky where the light was thinning, and the rust-colored dust of Vos 4 lay over everything with its usual indiscriminate thoroughness, including the struts and the hull seams, and the Imperial scout vessel that was ready to fly, and the spare jacket she was still wearing. She had not given it back. He noticed this. He did not say anything about it. "I have one question," he said. She waited. "The water in your canteen, what system is that from? I've been trying to place it for 3 days and I can't, and it's going to bother me." Something happened in her expression then, not the small movement of the corner of her mouth, not the brief contained smile, but something fuller and less guarded, arriving quickly and staying for a genuine moment before she brought it back under the composure she wore the way other people wore armor. It changed her face in a way that his 3 days of careful observation had not prepared him for, and he suspected that very few people had ever seen it, and he was aware, with a clarity that had nothing to do with engineering, that he had been given something. "It is from a private source," she said, "in a system that does not appear on public charts." "Is it on Imperial charts?" "It is on one chart," she said, "which is not available at the 4th tier." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he bent down, picked up the coolant line coupler he had set in the dust when the fleet arrived and had not yet found a reason to put away, and placed it neatly in the equipment pack. He closed the pack. He straightened up and looked at the ship, and at the canyon walls, and at the strip of sky between them where the stars were coming in and the black fleet waited. "Tell Gerald he's earned it," he said, and meant the commendation, and also meant something else, and thought she probably understood both. She reached into the weathered bag, the bag with its impossible interior, and produced his canteen, which she had refilled at some point without mentioning it, and held it out to him. He took it. Their hands did not quite touch, and also they did. Adeline picked up her bag. She looked at him once more with the full weight of that open, lit expression, and then she walked toward the ship, and the boarding ramp extended for her, and she went aboard. The ramp retracted. The ship's systems powered up with a rising hum that resonated through the canyon floor and into the soles of his boots. He stood back. The ship rose cleanly on struts that held, and a hull that held, and a navigation array that would not, he was reasonably confident, malfunction again, because he had done good work, and good work was the only kind he knew how to do when he was paying attention. It cleared the canyon rim. The fleet received it. The black ships held their formation for a long moment, and then they moved with that same impossible silence, and in 30 seconds the sky above Keller's Reach was empty and pale and ordinary, the way it always was. Daniel stood in the canyon floor with his canteen in his hand, and the rust-colored dust settling around him, and the twin suns beginning their staged descent toward the western rim. He looked up at the station, and at Gerald's antenna array catching the afternoon light. He thought about documentation. He thought about 4th-tier security classifications and periodic reviews at the discretion of the issuing authority and charts that did not appear in public navigation systems. He opened the canteen. The water was cold, and tasted of that mineral he could not place, from a system he could not name, in a canyon that Keller had descended into 3 centuries ago and never stopped complaining about. Daniel drank it slowly. He would go up. He would tell Gerald about the commendation, and Gerald would malfunction in celebration, and he would fix whatever Gerald broke, and he would file the security documentation, and he would do the next day's monitoring work, and the day after that, and the day after that. And at some point, at a time to be determined by the issuing authority, someone would tell him where to be. He found, to his moderate surprise, that he did not mind waiting. He had gotten good at it. He stood at the canyon rim for a long time after the fleet disappeared, long enough for the first sun to set, and the intermediate gold to come and go, and the second sun to begin its own slower descent. The sky cycled through its colors without asking his permission, the way it always had, the way it always would. Vos 4 did not adjust itself for significance. It had been rust and silence before him, and it would be rust and silence after, and it held his presence in it the way the canyon held the wind temporarily and without attachment. But he was not the same man who had eaten a ration pack of something claiming to be lentil soup 3 days ago, and heard a sound from the canyon below, and climbed down without thinking about it. He was not sure yet what man he was instead. That was, he suspected, going to take some time to determine. He had the canteen in his hand, and the security clearance he had not applied for, and the memory of a smile he had been given briefly and carefully, like something rare shown to someone deemed worth showing it to. He had the struts he had built, and the hull he had sealed, and the particular satisfaction of work done fully, without reservation, for someone who had knelt beside him in the dust and handed him tools and shared her water and said nothing that was not true. He had been alone for 4 years on the edge of everything, and he had made his peace with it, and the peace had been real. He wanted to be honest about that, because the alternative was a story about a man saved from loneliness by a remarkable woman, and that was not quite the right story. He had not been rescued. He had been reminded. There is a difference, and it matters, and it is the kind of difference that takes a long time in a quiet place to understand. What he had forgotten, somewhere in the 4 years of rust and silence and Gerald's companionable malfunctions, was not how to be with people. It was how to be with people and remain entirely himself, how to work beside someone and share water with them, and make jokes that landed in the space between laughing and not laughing, and build something functional out of broken components, and not lose in any of it the particular shape of who he was. Adeline had not changed him. She had reflected him clearly the way still water reflects, and what he had seen in that reflection had surprised him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because he had stopped expecting to see it. He thought about that. He thought about all the canyon floors and all the remote systems where someone is working on something broken and alone, and all the people who have made their peace with a smaller life, because the larger one asked too much of them at the wrong moment, and all the silences that have gone on just long enough to start feeling like permanent conditions rather than weather. He thought about the difference between disappearing into the quiet and choosing the quiet, and how fine that line is, and how easy it is to cross it without noticing, and how sometimes it takes something falling out of the sky to show you which side you're standing on. The second sun touched the canyon's western rim. The sky went amber, then deep rose, then the early violet of Voss for long evening. Above him, the stars appeared one at a time with the patience of things that have been there all along. He looked at them, at the uncountable spread of them, the outer rim's honest excess of light, and thought about a chart that existed somewhere, on a ship he had repaired with his own hands, that did not appear in any public navigation system. A system with water that tasted of minerals he could not name. He thought about all the things in the known galaxy that do not appear on public charts, and about all the things in any given person that do not appear on the surfaces they show the world, and about how the most important information has always been the kind you have to earn the clearance for. Above him, Gerald's antenna array caught the last of the rose light and held it briefly before the evening took it. From the processor unit came the low, familiar hum that meant Gerald was working, and content with working, which was the closest thing to peace that either of them had managed, and which would have to be enough, and was. Daniel turned from the canyon rim and went inside. The end. We've reached the end of our story, friends. Please don't forget to like the story, leave your thoughts about it in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next story. See you in the next story.